Those of you coming in, welcome. Welcome to CrimCon. My name is Dr. Brianna Beaupre. I am the host for Stream 1 today, and I'm also a board member of CrimCon. We're very excited about the number of people attending these sessions from all over the world. It's been fantastic. And so we're really excited to be hosting this first ever virtual conference for criminology. So just some things to keep in mind. The first rule we are going to break because we're changing the order in the program. So the individual presenters will say their names and their titles so you know which one is which. Each presenter will have 10 minutes. And then if you have questions as attendees, please type them in the Q&A box and the panelists will answer them at the end. And then this is what it should look like on your end as attendees. So remember to use the Q&A box and have fun. So we started CrimCon because we wanted to do something fun and accessible and interactive. And so we're really excited that you're here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And I will be the first panelist. I'm Krisztián Pósch. I'm at the University College London. I'm a lecturer in crime science, and I will be introducing the whole project. This is a longitudinal study called Policing the Pandemic, which was funded by University College London and LSE, and it took place in the UK between April this year and August. So first, I will be briefly discussing how policing the pandemic was handled in the UK. Then I will introduce the study design, the results, and finally I will summarize our findings. From the very beginning, policing the pandemic in the UK was guided by the so-called 4Es approach. First, police officers were encouraged to engage the public when enforcing lockdown restrictions, then explain why these restrictions are there, educate about the regulations and their purpose, encourage the public to follow appropriate behaviors, and finally enforce these rules as the last resort. So basically giving fixed penalty notices and using force if needed. These principles were rooted in procedural justice theory. These were unprecedented police powers that were given to the police, and basically the police had to tread lightly and were encouraged not to enforce as the first step, but as the last step. As partly as the result of this, there was no civil unrest in the UK. However, there were some signs of disproportionality in enforcement. So basically, racial minorities were more likely to receive fixed penalty notices and being force used against them. So we started our study. Our study was an online crowdsourced study of 102,000 participants, and we introduced a boost sample later on. I will come back to that. We had 6 waves. We followed up on the same people from late April to early August. We looked at 9 metropolitan areas and London. Each metropolitan area had 100 people and London had 300 people in it. There were slightly more female participants and the age mix was also slightly younger. However, to compensate for this, we used quota sampling rates, making our sample largely representative of these metropolitan areas for age and gender. And we also calculated attrition rates for the people who left the study early. The retention rates across these waves were really, really high. You can see that for the main sample, this started as 90%, and by the end, we still managed to retain roughly 3/4 of them. We introduced the boost sample at wave 3 because we realized that certain people, especially elderly participants and young male participants, were more likely to leave the study. So basically, we added 300 extra people to compensate for that at wave 3, and they stayed with us until wave 6 as well. As you can see, the ethnicity of the participant was 85% white and 50% from other racial backgrounds. These were pretty diverse participants in terms of jobs and economic status. Roughly 18% of them were considered key workers, so healthcare workers or other frontline workers. Several of them lost their jobs due to the pandemic and or struggled financially during this period. Less than 0.5% were diagnosed with COVID themselves. However, roughly 2.6% lost somebody to the virus. So when it comes to the survey, we introduced some core modules. These core modules were either focused on policing, especially personal experiences with the police and victimization, attitudes toward the police, such as procedural justice and police legitimacy, or attitudes toward the law, such as legal legitimacy and attitudes towards the new pandemic legislation. The other main focus was the pandemic itself. So we asked people about the attitudes toward the virus, whether they had contracted the virus, concerns, expectations, and so on. And from wave 2, we introduced fear of the virus and precautions taken against contracting the virus. The second group was being affected by the pandemic, so whether there were any economic or other consequences. And from wave 2, we also asked people about whether they managed to maintain social distancing, whether it was a possibility in their lives. We also, just a very few words about the timeline of our survey and what transpired in the UK. As you can see, we started our survey roughly 1 month in the lockdown. That wave in the UK, more than 8,000 people lost their lives to the virus. And as you can see, as wave progressed by wave 6, this dropped very significantly. So basically, we started from near the peak of the virus and continued our study until a so-called grace period over the summer, where the virus, the UK managed to suppress the virus. So the first wave was fielded 1 month in. Between the first and second wave, we experienced the peak in the UK, and the first lockdown easing was announced. Between wave 2 and 3, there was a big political scandal regarding one of the Prime Minister's top advisors who broke these lockdown restrictions. Between wave 3 and 4, the Black Lives Matter protest started in the UK as well. And basically between wave 4 and 6, we experienced a gradual easing of the lockdown in the UK and life getting closer and closer back to normal, but it never reached that, obviously. So to react to these changes over time, we introduced some rotating modules, including proper rotating modules that we asked every second wave on emotions and well-being. We also looked at the compliance with lockdown legislation, compliance with track, trace, and isolate, which was introduced at wave 3 and things like that. So try to be adaptive to the changes in the pandemic. And we also looked at certain things that emerged in particular waves, such as the political scandal surrounding Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's key advisor, and support for the Black Lives Matter movement that started after wave 3. So just to briefly discuss the headline findings from these studies, from these waves. First of all, we looked at contact with the police and victimization across the waves. What you can see is that victimization was very close to zero before the first wave. So since the start of the lockdown, people didn't really experience much victimization. However, there was an increased contact with the police, partly because we looked at a longer period compared to the other differences between waves. And you can also see that contact with the police was pretty mixed, so there wasn't a big big increase in contact with the police as the lockdown eased. However, and despite these differences with direct experiences with victimization and the justice system, what we found is that police legitimacy, perception of procedural justice, and willingness to cooperate with the police remained largely unchanged. So basically, no matter what happened, despite the changes in the pandemic, or in fact, the Black Lives Matter movement, attitudes remained very, very stable over time. And we looked at this for a very long period of time. So this is, I think, a surprising finding. We also looked at rules clarity. So as the rules changed, whether people found them clear. And what we found is that as more and more rules changed and as the lockdown eased gradually, people found it more and more difficult to follow these rules changes. However, when it came to social distancing as a legal requirement, which was made very early on in the pandemic, support for that remained very, very strong across the 6 waves. We also looked at public confidence in handling of the pandemic and found that early on there was a strong confidence. However, even before the political scandal erupted, this confidence waned and remained largely stable over time and not very positive. These are urban centers which are not very friendly towards the conservative government, so it was unsurprising. However, support for the NHS, the National Health Service, the public health service in the UK remained very, very strong over time. And finally, when it comes to concerns about contracting COVID, it got smaller and smaller and smaller over time. However, the expectations how long the pandemic will last increased over time as people realized that this pandemic will probably last for a long time. However, knowledge about the virus remained roughly the same over time. So just to summarize its results very quickly. So the focus of this longitudinal study was the first wave of the pandemic in the UK from the first peak to the summer grace period. What we found is that the perception of the police remained positive and largely unchanged despite all the changes that happened in this period. And there are indications that the 4E approach I outlined at the very beginning of the presentation seemed to have worked. There was a very quick erosion of trust in the government handling of the pandemic. However, there was a slow but steady decrease of clarity of the rules, despite the strong support for the legal foundations of social distancing. So the big question is, what does it mean now? Right now in the UK, we are in the second lockdown period. So there is an increased demand for enforcement both from the public and the government. So there is a fear that the police will be asked to enforce more, which can erode trust. There's a potentially smaller public support for the second lockdown compared to the first one. And also there is a fraying elite consensus and political opportunism, which would further decrease the consent for and compliance with the rules. So there are certain dangers for the police at the moment. Thank you for your kind attention.
Awesome, thank you. Next panelist. Perfect.
John, you're on mute.
Sorry. I'm going to talk about the findings from the first 3 waves on compliance. So as Chris mentioned, when lockdown occurred, I've got some mobility data here from March, April, May, June. It surprised everyone how much compliance there was and how little the police needed to do to intervene. So one of the key questions that we were interested in doing in asking is why? What was this compliance by consent or compliance by compulsion? And in particular, we were interested in understanding the role of the law. So did pandemic legislation make a difference? And if it did, why? So as we're kind of trained to do, we differentiated between instrumental motivations to comply with lockdown and social distancing and normative. Instrumental being fear of getting caught by the police, but also fear of catching COVID. Normative, we thought, was social norms. We needed to take that into account. But when it comes to the role that the law can play, we were interested in differentiating between legitimacy of legal authorities and the expressive function of the law. I'll talk about that more in a second. So we were interested in understanding which motivations were most important and whether the motivations changed over time. So I just want to very quickly talk you through how we measured compliance. So this is self-reported client compliance. And we asked people in the past week, how often have you engaged in the following behaviors: socialized in person with friends or relatives who you don't live with, go out for a walk, run or cycle and spend more than a few minutes stopping somewhere, traveling for leisure. These were all things which were illegal in the first 2 of our waves, i.e. in April and May, but became legal in June, which was wave 3. So we were interested in modeling the predictors of self-reported compliance. Because we had a panel study, we were interested in modeling the predictors at each wave separately, but also modeling changes in self-reported compliance over time. So we used cross-lag panel analysis to model change. I got a list of the potential predictors here. So we've got concern about catching COVID, knowledge about COVID, expectation about the length of the pandemic. Then we've got deterrence, legal legitimacy, police legitimacy, social norms, expressive function of the law, gender, age, and city. So Chris mentioned that this was a panel study that which was in 10 cities across the UK. So I'll just take you very quickly through the findings. So levels of compliance were high in wave 1, decreased slightly by wave 2. By wave 3, they were a fair bit lower. However, we shouldn't be talking about these things as compliance because at that point, the behaviors were no longer illegal. So I'm now summarising the findings from both the analysis of each wave separately and the panel analysis. So concern about catching COVID was a factor, particularly in wave 3 it became a factor. Knowledge about COVID was also a consistent factor throughout. Legitimacy came in at wave 3 when the rules were less strict. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. I think for 10 minutes, it's one of those details that's I shouldn't give too much time to. Deterrence throughout was not a factor. So people's perceptions of the chances of getting caught by the police, this was not a predictor of anything really. What was the two main things that we found were social norms, which I assume that no one will find surprising. However, you do need to take this into account, and the expressive function of the law. And I've got because these are the two interesting things going on in our study, I think, I got the measures so you can see how we approach this. So we approach social norms as a very eclectic kind of mixture of pro-prescriptive norms, in-group norms, and social norms, moral norms. So everyone should strictly follow social distancing to help prevent the spread of COVID. Most people in my local community think it's the right thing to do, to strictly follow social distancing guidelines. Most people would disapprove if people were not following it. And here, this is perhaps very specific to the UK. Well, certainly it's because of the name National Health Service. But the fact that people were rallying around to help public health service, and the fact that people thought it was important to help this public health service. So we included that as a measure of our social norms, and all these things kind of loaded on one underlying factor. And then expressive function of the law, we asked, do you think it's right or wrong to make social distancing a legal requirement? By making it a legal requirement, the government sent the message that social distancing is important to fight the pandemic. And making it a legal requirement clarified what we should and should not be doing. So the idea here is that the fact that this brute fact of lockdown for everybody helped send a message to people, helped frame the threat as a collective threat, and help frame the solution as a collective solution. So we should be doing this because this is the way for the country to come out on the other side. So I just want to talk a little bit more about the theoretical implications of all this. So, I mean, the social norms stuff is more social psychology, but people were looking at the behavior of others, determine what is normal, beneficial, and acceptable. We benefit from acting in certain ways through social approval, but also refraining from acting in certain ways through social disapproval. Informal rules that govern our behavior bind us together in social groups and help us and strengthen our identification within those groups. But in particular, I think the most interesting thing for us is that while legitimacy came in towards the end, throughout, really, it was about this expressive function of the law. So we think that acting in unison brought people together, not only because it was a way of reaffirming kind of group identity and acting according to informal rules, but also because there was a legal requirement to coordinate at the group level against a common threat. And so this speaks to the notion or the idea it's more within legal theory, I guess, but this notion of that a law has a coordination function and an expressive quality. It sends a message about what needs to be done and why. And in this particular instance, I think it worked alongside the informal rules to clarify to people what needs to be done, how we need to coordinate to help fight the pandemic. So I was so scared of doing this within 10 minutes. I'm actually at the end of my presentation. So I've got some extra slides which I thought might be needed, but probably not. So I'll just say a little bit now, just to fill the last couple of minutes. Now the question is, what happens in our second lockdown? The second lockdown in the UK is very different to the first one. It is a lockdown in name only, really. There's so many ambiguities. Pubs and restaurants aren't open. I would say that's the biggest thing. So here's some speculations on how this might play out over the next month or two. Now, with the vaccine news may change things. Who knows? But I would say that at least within the UK, performative behaviours based on a simple message will continue to be widespread. I think in the UK, at least, the simple message of wear a mask in certain spaces, and there's strong social norms about it. I think that will play out. But more broadly, rules in the law are much less clear. There's a lot more ambiguities. I think trust in government is lower and will continue to be important. I think compliance with track, trace and isolate will continue to be a big issue. Compliance with calls to isolate in this country seem to be relatively low. More broadly low, I would say that social norms will continue to play an important role. We don't have any data about this latest part of the Corona coaster, but I would imagine that legitimacy of the police and the law is important in this time, and therefore continuing to maintain legitimacy through procedurally fair, light touch policing, which does seem to be the case so far in the UK, will remain important. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll pass over to Arabella.
Thanks, John. Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah, that's perfect. Great.
All right, thanks. So hi, everyone. My name's Arabella. I'm a research fellow in policing at University College London. I'm going to be talking to you about what happened in the early days of the lockdown. So I'll be taking you back to April this year in relation to the public cooperating in the fight against the pandemic in a more active sense. So as of the end of March and into April, it was illegal to leave home without a reasonable excuse, and social distancing was made a legal requirement. Two forms of social control that became increasingly evident in April were members of the public, one shouting at those breaking social distancing regulations to go home, and two calling the police to report those breaking social distancing regulations. I should make the point here that we don't think that either of these are ethically desirable behaviors, but I still think that it's interesting and important to understand why people might engage in such activity. So in April, as John noted in his talk, public compliance seems to have been remarkably widespread, and the police rarely had to intervene to enforce people to abide by the social distancing regulations. And indeed, polling results at the time suggested that people post-COVID-19 think a fair bit more positively about the police. So what psychological mechanism was underlying the public's positive attitudes towards the police? Was it about people thinking less in terms of me and more in terms of we when defining who they are? More technically in terms of a shared police identity? In other words, what I'm trying to say is that might people be framing their social control activity through their relationship with police? The argument that social identification drives behavior is well rehearsed. So we know from the social psychological literature that by defining who we are, norms define social groups and are especially powerful in driving behavior when people identify with a particular social group. We also know from the policing literature that social identity matters when predicting compliance and cooperation specifically. So drawing on the well-established process model of procedural justice theory then, we tested a pathway that predicts that fair treatment at the hands of the police generates feelings of inclusion, status, and belonging within salient social categories. In turn, a sense of shared group membership with the police engenders cooperation and compliance. And in our case, that's in the form of social control of COVID-19 lockdown regulations. So what else might have motivated readiness to engage in social control activity? We tested police identification against another important identity in the COVID context, which we don't think has much to do with policing at all, and that's identification with the NHS. Thanks, John, for explaining that. The NHS have been at the forefront of the COVID-19 response. So especially back in April, every day we heard on the news of our heroic NHS frontline workers battling the pandemic to save lives. And what had become a weekly tradition in the UK, the nation came together every Thursday at 8 p.m. as part of something called the Clap for Our Carers campaign. And this was to applaud NHS workers at this unprecedented time. And rainbow posters had become a symbol of support for people wanting to show solidarity with the NHS. And these had been displayed around the country. And indeed, polling results at the time suggested that people post-COVID-19 think a lot more positively about the National Health Service. So we expected identification with the NHS or put more simply, solidarity with the NHS, to predict readiness to engage in social control activity, because the key message that the NHS was promoting was to work together to combat the virus. We also included one more plausible non-policing predictor of social control activity in this context, for fairly obvious reasons, and that was trust in the government to deal with COVID-19. So what I've talked about so far can be distilled into this one key research question. In the early days of the lockdown, what was motivating people to engage in social control of COVID-19 lockdown regulations? Were these policing motivators or other important motivators in the COVID context? So to answer this particular question, we drew on first wave data from our multi-wave panel study, which was collected on the 21st of April this year, so at the peak of the pandemic in the UK. Had people developed a shared identity with the NHS and with the police? The answer here is yes. So we asked people to rate their level of identification with the NHS and with the police. And as you can see in this table, people reported high levels of identification with both authorities, especially in response to feeling a sense of solidarity with NHS workers and with the police. So this heightened identification with the NHS and the police at the peak of the pandemic is not very surprising. The search of a productive role in society, in the midst of being asked to do nothing, so stay at home, might very well be found in followership of those that are asked to do a lot. Were people self-reporting engagement in social control activity? So to measure social control, we asked participants this question. If you saw people breaking the rules on social distancing, for example, having a barbecue in a local park, how likely would you be to do the following? 1, shout at them to go home. Here, 21% of our sample said fairly likely or very likely. And 2, call the police to report them. Here, 40% of our sample said fairly likely or very likely. So here's the model that we tested. We tested a model with the 2 forms of social control as 2 separate outcome variables. So we had shout at people to go home and call the police to report them. As shown in this figure, for each social control outcome variable, we tested A, whether a shared police identity explained variation in self-reported social control, B, whether an NHS identity explained variation in self-reported social control, and C, trust in the government to deal with COVID was included as an additional exogenous predictor of social control. And we also controlled for age, ethnicity, and the education of our participants in the model. So here's what we found. Did policing make a difference to people's social control behavior? Yes. So a shared police identity predicted social control of COVID-19 lockdown regulations, both the informal social control variable, shout at people to go home, and calling the police. In other words, those who said that they often called the police to report breaking the rules on social distancing or shouted at them to go home felt a stronger sense of solidarity with the police compared to people who never did those things. And in line with the policing literature, we found the indirect effects from procedural justice to both social control outcome variables via police identification to be significant. So did other non-policing factors make a difference to people's social control behavior? First, what about social identification with the NHS? The answer here is no. So the NHS identity was not associated with either of the social control outcome variables. In other words, those who felt a strong sense of solidarity with the NHS were no more likely to call the police to report people breaking the rules on social distancing or shout at them to go home, compared to those who felt a weaker sense of solidarity with the NHS. Second, what about trust in government to deal with COVID? Did this make a difference to people's social control behavior? Again, no. So trust in the government was not associated with either of the social control variables. So the take-home message of my talk is that solidarity with the police, but not with the NHS, promoted cooperation in the fight against the pandemic in an active sense, so to engage in social control of COVID-19 lockdown regulations. We found that throughout the pandemic, many people maintained a sense of shared identity, both with the police and with the NHS. But it was solidarity with the police and not the NHS that promoted social control activity. So social control activity, even during a pandemic, seems to be framed through people's relationship with the police. And importantly, those who perceived fair treatment at the hands of the police were more likely to develop the feelings of solidarity that promoted such behavior. Another important factor in the COVID context, trust in the government, was not important when it came to social control activity. So at the height of the pandemic, that was the picture. But what about now? I think it's worth a speculation given that we're halfway through the second lockdown put in place on November 5th in the UK. So it appears that social control activity has continued, Although less often, members of the public are still calling the police to report the more obvious breaches to COVID restrictions, and are still encouraged to do so by police forces across the country. Solidarity with the police, however, appears to be fading. According to a report published by the Police Foundation, it appears that heightened sensitivity to rule breaking over the last month, especially as depicted on the media, has fed into negative views of the police. So there appears to be an enforcement gap, whereby there are clear signs that the public wants to see the police enforcing the law in order to protect public health. Given these developments, has the narrative behind social control activity switched from supporting the police to deal with COVID to we need to push the police to enforce more? You'll hear more about this from my colleague Julia, who will be talking to you about support for enhanced police powers during the COVID-19 crisis. It seems that people's relationships with police also have important implications for their willingness to empower the police in times of crisis. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Arabella, for the spoiler alert. I gotta wait for you to.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, awesome. Okay, hopefully you can see that.
Yep,
Let me set my timer. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us this evening for us. So my talk is going to be looking at support for enhanced police powers during the pandemic. So we were interested in understanding what powers the British public support and what the underlying drivers are of support for these powers. And I should mention my name's Julia, and I'm also a research fellow in the Institute for Global City Policing at UCL. So to understand what factors might predict support for granting police additional powers during the pandemic, we can look to research on police empowerment in non-pandemic times. So to empower police means to positively accept a development that grants police more power, including an acceptance of risk that this power may be misused. And previous research has explored predictors of support for police empowerment, including greater police autonomy and discretion, support for police militarization and use of force, and support for police use of new technologies, including live facial recognition and the use of drones. And this research has shown that, oh, why is it not working? Okay, this research has shown that public willingness to grant police extra powers is dependent on the extent to which people view the police as trustworthy and legitimate authorities. So when people feel the police exercise their authority in a fair and just manner, they're more likely to accept the right of the police to determine what's appropriate and acceptable, and are therefore more likely to support empowering police and granting them greater authority. In other words, people support police empowerment because they generally believe police do the right things for the right reasons, and that their actions are intrinsically good and appropriate. And research has also found that normative judgments about the police are much more important predictors of police empowerment than instrumental concerns, such as concern about crime. So it seems that trust in the people being empowered is more important than the ends towards which the new powers are oriented, such as a reduction in crime. So our research questions were, what police powers do the public support, and what are the underlying drivers of support for police powers? And we look at trust and legitimacy as potential drivers, along with other variables related to the pandemic. So in our survey, participants were presented with this question. So we asked them whether they supported or opposed granting the police a number of specific powers. And the data I'm going to present comes from the very first wave of our study in April 2020. So we presented participants with 6 potential new powers, which covered 3 different areas. First, we had one item capturing the curbing of free expression. So participants were asked whether they supported making it a criminal offence to spread false information about contagious diseases. Second, we had 2 items measuring police enforcement. So we asked whether people supported the police having the power to use an on-the-spot fine or to use force on people they find out of their homes without justification. And lastly, we had 3 items which measured surveillance. So we asked whether people were supportive of the use of drones, live facial recognition technology, and tracking people's mobile phones. So what powers do the public support? So on this chart, the pink part of the bar represents those who support or strongly support each power. And we found that participants were most supportive of the power curbing free expression. So 75% supported or strongly supported making it a criminal offense to spread false information. Slightly fewer, but still a majority of participants supported issuing an on-the-spot fine. Fewer people supported the use of force against people who failed to follow social distancing legislation. And we can see that the surveillance powers had the lowest levels of support. So only 30% supported the use of drones and 21% each the use of facial recognition and the tracking of mobile phones. But what are the underlying drivers of support for these powers? So I'm going to present the explanatory variables we used in our analysis before going over our findings. So consistent with previous research into police empowerment, we test whether trust in police drives support for police powers, and we measured two aspects of trust. We measured procedural justice and bounded authority, so whether people think the police operate within appropriate boundaries and do not exceed their authority. We also test whether police legitimacy predicts support for police powers, and again we measured two aspects. Normative alignment, so whether people think the police act and behave in accordance with societally shared moral values, and duty to obey, so whether people feel a moral obligation to obey the police. And we also included two measures related to COVID-19. So first, whether people were concerned about the virus, and second, what their expectations were regarding the virus. So we asked them, how long do you expect it will be until the coronavirus outbreak is over and things are back to normal in the UK? And we also controlled for a range of demographic variables and personal experiences with both the pandemic and the police. So this is our model, and we use structural equation modeling to test for direct and indirect effects. And I'll go through the findings step by step. So first, looking at legitimacy, we found that duty to obey had a significant association with both support for enforcement and support for surveillance powers. Duty to obey also had a significant but weaker association with support for curbing free expression. Normative alignment, on the other hand, had a moderately strong association with expression. It had a weaker association with enforcement, but no association with support for surveillance. So it seems that of the two legitimacy measures, duty to obey is the most important predictor of support for enforcement and surveillance powers. Normative alignment seems to be more important for predicting curbs on free expression. Next, bringing in trust in police, we found little evidence that procedural justice or bounded authority had direct associations with support for police powers. However, both measures were significant predictors of the two legitimacy measures, and we found significant indirect effects. So normative alignment significantly mediated the impact of procedural justice on expression. In other words, procedural justice had an indirect effect on expression, which was transmitted through normative alignment. We found that duty to obey significantly mediated the impact of both procedural justice and bounded authority on support for enforcement and surveillance powers. And the indirect effects implied that more than half of the impact of duty to obey was attributable to the downstream effects of procedural justice and bounded authority. Looking last at our COVID-related predictors, we found that concern about the virus had significant associations with all three aspects of police powers. So people who were more concerned about the virus were more supportive of giving police new powers. But concern about COVID had a much smaller impact compared to police legitimacy. We found that expectations about the timeframe to get back to normal had a weak but significant association with enforcement and curbs on free expression. So people who thought the crisis would last longer were slightly more supportive of certain measures. So taken together, these findings indicate that police legitimacy had the primary influence on people's acceptance of increased police powers. In the case of police enforcement and surveillance, duty to obey the police was most important. So people who felt an obligation to obey police were more comfortable with giving police additional powers to enforce the new legislation. For curbs on free expression, shared values and norms expressed by normative alignment were the most influential. Next, although trust in police was not directly related to support for police powers, we found multiple indirect effects through legitimacy. So legitimacy transmitted the impact of procedural justice and bounded authority on support for police powers. And these findings are consistent with a host of other research, which supports the idea that legitimacy is rooted in people's direct and indirect contact with police officers, and particularly whether those officers act in respectful ways and make neutral and accountable decisions as they engage in everyday policing. So it seems that how police officers treat people has important implications for the acceptance or rejection of new police powers. So generating trust and legitimacy during the pandemic through consistent, fair, and encouraging policing may mean people will be more likely to accept granting police additional powers should that be necessary. And lastly, we found that concern about contracting the virus had a relatively small impact on support for police powers, which suggests that public support for police empowerment has a very strong normative basis, which is grounded in police legitimacy, while instrumental concerns, such as concern about the virus, only play a small role. So as I mentioned earlier, it seems that trust in the people being empowered, in this case, the police, is more important than the ends towards which the new powers are oriented. And that's me. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So now we will open it up for questions. Please ask your questions in the Q&A and I'll read them verbally and the panelists can answer. So I'll ask a question since none have come in yet. What was the most interesting or surprising finding you had from each of your studies?
I guess I could start just because that was the first substantive thing. I think Chris will remember when we were discussing how to measure expressive function of the law. I think it seemed sort of instinctively kind of interesting, and one of those weird situations in which the expressive function of the law is actually could really be important. This sort of message sending kind of symbolism, framing threats and responses to threats at a collective level. But I personally was surprised at how well it worked. I was very happy because it felt like an intuition that we had at the time. And yeah, the fact that it sort of panned out and maybe made sense empirically and certainly does make sense theoretically. I thought that was nicely surprising.
Shall I go next? So, I mean, I mentioned this in my talk, but obviously the bit of the analysis that I ran had to do with social identification with the health service in the UK and with the police service in the UK. And I think it was quite shocking to us to find that it was identification, or put more simply, solidarity with the police that made the difference when it came to social control activity, and that the high levels of solidarity that people were feeling with the National Health Service didn't seem to play a role when it came to social control activity. So I'd say that that was a little bit shocking.
I guess it's me. I guess what I found the most interesting, maybe about the two aspects of legitimacy and how they impacted on the different types of police powers that we had. So we found that duty to obey was more important for predicting support for enforcement and surveillance, whereas normative alignment was more important for predicting curbs on free expression. And this kind of makes sense because the question is kind of asking about whether we think the public themselves would violate a social norm by kind of spreading false information online. So I think we would expect that would be related to how people feel in terms of aligning with the police. So I'd say that's quite interesting. And yeah, and I guess support for police powers, maybe they were lower than I would have thought, especially the surveillance powers are very low. But yeah, I don't know what anybody else from my study thinks about that.
Yeah, so from your presentation, I think one of the key findings, I think, is that even though several people would have assumed that concern about COVID-19 would drive this kind of support to enhance police powers, what we find is that it has some impact, but a very, very little one. So it's not about, these things are rooted in trust in the police and police legitimacy. So if the government should decide to take over using these powers, that can only happen if the public trusts them to do so. So that's I think the most important finding. And from my own presentation, I would like to highlight again the remarkable consistency that we found when it came to attitudes towards the police across 6 waves. And these were very unusual times. We didn't see much change, not only in the headline findings when it comes to the errors, so standard errors around these measurements. People kept thinking about the police in very similar ways, despite the Black Lives Matter movement, despite everything that happened in this period. So I think that's very surprising, and I didn't expect that to happen.
That is interesting. Let's see. I thought Justin. Okay, so somebody answered that. So Justin was asking about the 4 E's approach, and a link was included. Anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah. Sorry. I didn't mean that to just be the answer. So yeah, this is a really effective instance of communication, and from the College of Policing tries to set standards for police across the UK, and the engage was, speak to people, try to establish their awareness and understanding of the situation. The explain was about talking about risks, explaining the regulations, highlighting responsibilities that we all share. Encourage is like, okay, I've now explained it to you, so why don't you just, maybe go home and do what you should be doing, but always in a nice way. And then the enforce is the last resort. So enforcement as last resort. I mean, just to say that I think all this stuff just really does chime with the policing by consent kind of approach to policing in the UK, which is just an old way of, procedural justice is just a new way of describing that. And I think it's been really effective because the police haven't been needed very much, maybe more so now. But the fact that it was communicated to police officers in a very simple way does show it a good it's a good instance of leadership and clear communication, which I think the police were just very happy to hear, because police officers, at least in our country, don't want to be doing this stuff. They don't want to be blamed for the health crisis, and they don't want to be put in this sort of situation. So giving them a kind of very clear, just enforcement as last resort kind of approach, I think my sense is that was really, really well appreciated.
Yeah, and to quickly add to that, if you consider the gulf between just France and the UK, these are very close countries in Europe. However, when it comes to fines given out, France exceeded the UK almost 100 times, which shows that they took a more enforcement-driven approach, and you could see that there are several examples of civil unrest in France, in other countries like Spain and Italy as well, where enforcement was the main way to handle these situations and not the UK way of policing by consent. So I think that's a really big distinction between European countries and what the UK did.
Great. We have another question. How did you gain the information of families struggling to put food on the tables at one point?
We asked them. So basically, each wave we asked whether your life were affected by the pandemic, and there was a list, and one of them was this, whether they had means to put sufficient food on the table. Okay.
And then question for Arabella. Did you measure identification with the state more generally beyond trust in government?
So we certainly didn't include that variable in the analysis that I presented. Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we measured identification with the state more generally in any of our waves.
No, so we measured identification with being a law-abiding citizen and being a British citizen.
That's right.
Great. Any other questions? Please put in the Q&A.
I can feel the deadening Zoom void while people think of questions. Right now there is some pressure from the UK government, particularly our Home Secretary, to push police into more enforcement, more tougher responses, perhaps less away from the EEE thing. Yeah, Ben and I were involved in a call with some like some UK kind of special advisors to the government, etc. I can see certain people in the UK government and in the police trying to figure out how to resist this kind of this pressure, because I can see that, you know, the police don't want to be involved in enforcement style approaches. I mean, obviously there's the high risk kind of instances where people are having house parties and all that sort of stuff. I don't mean that. I just mean like the pressure from top down to take less of a procedural justice approach and to be more handing out fines, like Chris was saying. I don't know. I think maybe our approach was just to say to them that, you know, all these unintended side consequences, not only do the police not want to do it, but it kind of risks, it may kind of encourage situational compliance, but it risks these sort of backfiring where communities see the police as losing some of their legitimacy, even if in the moment they do want to see tough responses.
Great. And so we need to wrap up this panel. It ended a minute ago. So thank you all panelists for presenting your work, even though I know it's 7 p.m. there, now almost 8 p.m. We appreciate you coming to CrimCon. And for those of you who are attending the next session, I'm going to close out this webinar and a new session will start. So feel free to click the link in the program to get back in. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.